my title is Control Freaks. What in the world is that about? I'm beginning with pictures of two objects. The object that is on the left, anybody know what it is? I'll tell you in a minute.
A drill. Steam engine. A drill.
A drill, a steam engine. I heard oil derrick in previous presentations to my students. What's on the right?
One of the old computers.
It's a good audience. Let's talk a little bit about the consequences of technology. One of the consequences that we know is a technology that's invented for one purpose often is repurposed. So I heard steam engine, and indeed what you saw was the first steam engine. It was invented in 1712 for pumping water out of mines. We do a lot of other things with steam engines these days, needless to say. That slide on the right was indeed of a mainframe computer. It was from Princeton, New Jersey in 1950. Computers, as I'm sure everyone in this audience knows, were essentially invented for the purpose of fighting wars. Crunching numbers, but you crunched the numbers so you could fight the wars. The caption on that photograph said, "A new type of electronic brain that will save years of time and millions of dollars in the design and construction of guided missiles, ships, planes, and submarines." It was the Department of Defense that was paying for all this. Similarly, as again this audience knows, the internet was not invented so we could all put up our Twitter posts. It was indeed invented as a way of decentralizing communication in case of nuclear attack in this country. There often are not just additional uses of technologies, but unintended consequences of those technologies. To take a simple example, oil was discovered as a fuel. Terrific. The United States would not be fighting in the Middle East if there were no oil. Or we take something a little closer to home here, the manufacture of computers. Terrific devices, unless you live downstream from where the effluviant has been flowing. Or mobile phones, more modern technology. There's a lot of concern about the depletion of the rare metals that are used in those mobile phones. There also have been consequences of specific language technologies. I'd like to talk about some of the earlier technologies and the consequences, and then we'll get to the online and mobile ones that we know and love. The printing press. Roughly 1455 it was developed. It had an enormous effect on the spread of literacy. Protestantism would not have come to be the way that we know it if Martin Luther did not have access to a press and publish many, many tracts with it. We also know that eventually print was responsible for standardization of spelling, at least in English. It took about 200 years before that happened, but eventually it did. The telegraph, again, as this audience probably knows, had a big impact on the way news is disseminated, as well as on the way we write, at least in the United States. The Associated Press was formed as a way of stopping fights at the telegraph office. Very simply put, an event would happen and all the reporters who used to use carrier pigeons, but now they had the telegraph to get their story out with, they'd all make a beeline for the same poor one telegrapher. And they would fight to get their story out first. So the way of ending those fights was to have one story go out. It went under the name of the Associated Press, and for many decades, as we know, many of the columns on the front page of newspapers across the United States were AP stories. Similarly, American writing style was enormously affected via people such as Ernest Hemingway, who had this simplified style compared with what characterized, say, the middle of the 19th century. We also know, and Hemingway wrote about the fact, he started his life as a journalist, filing stories at the telegraph office, and they had to be short-sentenced. The telephone. Alexander Graham Bell had in mind for us to talk with our loved ones. He also wanted us to listen to concerts and such on the telephone. But the telephone came to have additional functions. The business world realized very quickly it was wonderful that you didn't have to send a telegram if you wanted to do something that might not be totally legal. So an awful lot of shady business deals were done at the end of the 19th century, probably further after that as well, because there was no written record. Unintended, how many of you have, or us, have been on speaker phones where we thought we were talking with one individual? Alas, we're being broadcast. And then there are these things called answering machines that today we call voicemail. I'll get back to it. So the question is, what kinds of consequences are there for online and mobile language technologies, the kinds of things that we here are doing research on? What kinds of technologies are we talking about? What sorts of assumptions do we make about how those technologies work? Are they legitimate assumptions? And then to cut to the chase of what I want to talk about mainly today, are there other real consequences that have not been in the forefront of people's minds? Okay, the technologies at issue: online communications such as email, instant messages, blogs, social networking sites, Facebook, Twitter, MySpace, and so forth. Mobile phones, and I'll here not say devices, but just phones, because I'll only be talking about two of the functions that mobile devices can do, namely voice and text of one sort or another. Some of those common assumptions that we make about the effects of these new language technologies. One of them that a number of the people in the audience here have written about is that some kind of new language exists, and it's called many things. It could be e-style, it could be NetSpeak, it could be texting lingo, textisms, and so forth. Characterized by, as we know, things such as abbreviations and acronyms, maybe random spellings, maybe random punctuations. Hint, they're not as random as you think. And that somehow this new language is threatening the standard language. Well, there are some alternative arguments that the primary effects of online and mobile technologies are not really upon language, but upon our social interaction. An overview of what I'll be talking about today. We'll start with some myths and half-truths about online and mobile language. We'll then look at the notion of control in interpersonal interaction. We'll talk some about multitasking, and then look at consequences and alternatives to controlling conversations. Let's start with some of these myths and half-truths about online and mobile language. The first that I'll spend just 30 seconds on at most, because this audience knows at least as much as I do about it, is that somehow there is this single electronic style, call it what you will, and that style is having deleterious effect on offline language. We know that there's an incredible amount of variety. We know when you look at large corpora, particularly for people who are, quotes, older users, college students, young adults, and so forth, the amount of acronyms and abbreviations used is really not as large as the press would have us believe. And it also turns out that the punctuation is pretty predictable, a little different sometimes from traditional offline writing, but not nearly as random as characterized. We also are finding and have evidence for that the majority of young users are very clear about when to do style shifts. The study done by the Pew Internet and American Life project a year or so ago pointed out very clearly that people don't, 12 to 17 years old in the States, don't even think of, say, their IM or their text messaging as being writing. It's something else. Writing is what you do in school. Writing is what you're supposed to do when you don't use contractions and don't start sentences with conjunctions. There's another half-truth that I did a little research into a year or two ago about emoticons. The myth is that we just are going to misunderstand each other if we communicate online, and therefore it's necessary for us to put these smiley faces, frownies, or whatever into the text, or else we're just going to not be able to communicate clearly with one another. I'll give you my punchline before I give you the data. Namely, we've been writing for millennia. And are we always clear? No. But we haven't worried nearly as obsessively about this issue with so-called offline traditional writing, whether it's in hieroglyphs or whether it's in notepads, as we do with what's online.